And we will get started. All right, so the topic for this morning's discussion is equipping parents for education advocacy. Um, Really, what I think we do well, and is always my goal at Hickman Louder when working with clients, is not only supporting them in school meetings, but giving them knowledge and confidence to be in those meetings independently as well. So sometimes a client needs us in meetings and they need that level of support, but really we're educating the client about the process and their rights throughout so that they can stand alone when they need to. And this is our education team. There's myself, Janet Fleck Griffith, and Mary Jo O'Neill is our education advocate. Frank Hickman is our one of our founding partners at Hickman Louder. He has been practicing education law for about 50 years. Mary Jo and myself are very honored and privileged to be able to work with him and learn from him. He's a phenomenal attorney and really a genuine advocate for children. So that's your education team. So today we're going to talk about a couple of things. Today's pretty comprehensive, so we are going to maybe stay fairly high level. I really like to start at the beginning, which is how do you know when to ask for supports? And then we'll work through the different types of supports that are available from interventions to 504s and IEPs. And we'll talk a little bit about the structure of IEPs and end with best practices. Okay, so first things first, when to ask for help. I think this can sometimes be a challenging question for parents, particularly because when it's our first child, it's the first time we've ever done this, right? And every child is so unique in their development, not only their academic development, but their social emotional development and their behavioral development, that there are certainly times when you're like, this doesn't seem right, but I'm just not sure if this is a cause for concern. So I like to cover this because while this isn't like specifically legal, um, I think it's helpful to think through when you're sort of trying to gauge whether or not to ask for help. So these are different variables I think that you can consider if you're in a situation where you think your child might need support, but you're not quite sure. With some children, it's very clear when they need support. I think with your more, there's other cases where it's not as clear. And a good example of that is some of what we sometimes call invisible disabilities, like ADHD and anxiety, where it's really hard to gauge, is this typical level stress and anxiety, or is this something more? So here's some variables you can consider. I think your pediatrician is always a wonderful person to consult on these things. So developmental milestones, behavior, and sensory, and whether or not this is age appropriate, because these things certainly evolve as children get older. If your child has any history of trauma, I work with a lot of families that are foster care families or adoptive families, and those children may have complicated histories that include trauma, and that can be a factor. Physical ailments, oftentimes physical ailments, when they're not like clearly a cold or the flu or something, physical ailments can sometimes actually be related to anxiety or something else that's going on with your kids. Social interactions, do they seem to be socializing in a similar way to their peers? And this is social interactions. I think that once your kid is in a preschool setting, a daycare setting, or a school setting, it's always great to reach out to those teachers and caregivers, because one thing that we don't replicate at home very often outside of a birthday party is the environment of a school or a daycare where there's lots of children and same aged peers. So are their social interactions pretty typical of their same age peers? Poor grades or teacher reports, particularly with older children, when those grades start to change, that can be indicative of a need for more support. A good example, I think, is ADHD, because that is a condition that some, like, our twice exceptional kids, or very savvy kids, can find their own strategies to sort of get by for a while. And then they reach a point in their academic career where the demands become more intense and their ADHD begins to manifest more. Attitude about school changing. So if you have a kiddo that generally liked going to school and suddenly seems resistant, disorganized attention issues, hyperactivity, executive functioning stuff, right? Um, Discussions with pediatricians. So this I already mentioned. The pediatrician is a great person to bounce these ideas off of. And then the last thing that I think, as a mother myself, is worth sharing is parent guardian instinct. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I think if your instinct is telling you something's up, it's definitely worth an appointment with your pediatrician as an initial starting point, and kind of explore that further. So I have a quick slide. Oh, sorry, guys. Let me try not to mess this up. Okay, so I have a quick slide here about trauma and development. Like I said, I do work a lot with families that have children that experienced foster care or were adopted and might have had, you know, a beginning to life that included some challenges. And so I'd just like to touch on the fact that trauma can impact development. One of the ways we that trauma is articulated is through something called adverse childhood experiences, or ACE scores. And what ACE scores do is they sort of look at what has occurred with that child. And if they've experienced certain trauma events, they would get like a point for each event. And then if you say something like, this child has an ACE score of a 4 or a 5, that communicates to someone else who's aware of ACE scores, that child may have had some significant trauma, that may have an impact on their development. So not everyone uses ACE scores, but again, I just think it's important to identify when a child has experienced something like this. Trauma and its impact on development is a little less tangible than concrete diagnoses, but it can still impact their ability to be accessible for learning at school, particularly if you have a child with anxiety, but maybe they're not diagnosed with something else like ADHD, but anxiety is sort of like their major barrier. If they have a trauma background, I really think that um, helps communicate the extent of their anxiety, because those children with trauma backgrounds can be easily triggered. So I think this is worth mentioning. ACE scores look at two different types of trauma instances: experiences and environmental aspects. So experiences are something that the child has experienced directly. Environmental impacts are things that are happening in their environment. The last thing I'll say about this is, we know that when children are like 0 to 2 and 0 to 5, attachment bonding is a critical part of their development. And attachment bonding occurs when they have a good, close, caring relationship with the adults and guardians in their lives. And those relationships, those positive relationships, create a feeling of trust and safety with that young infant, or toddler. And good attachment bonding leads to like good brain development. Some children don't experience good secure attachment bonding, and that it can impact development. A lot of this stems from the concept of toxic stress and how trauma and poor attachment bonding contribute to toxic stress and development. Okay, so where do you start when they're kids? Let's start chronologically first. Our littlest kiddos can be part of early intervention services. So these are for our kiddos that are 0 to 3. I don't spend a lot of time in this world, but I always like to mention it, particularly because our clients often have siblings. So if you ever have a child in your life, whether it's your own or someone that you know, and you think they're experiencing some developmental challenges, you can reach out to your local Help Me Grow. Early intervention is sort of like the federal nationwide way of name for this. And then each state and sometimes counties have their own name for it, but it's early intervention services. It's meant to serve children from 0 to 3. And they begin with an assessment. So you can contact them. That's the referral you'll see on the side here. The early intervention process is on the left. So it begins with a referral, which is essentially you contacting the county. They'll do an assessment and eligibility determination. And if a child qualifies for early intervention services, the family will get some additional support. Sometimes that support happens in the home. And this can be a really great tool for families with young children. And then when the children turn 3, they are evaluated for whether or not they need an IEP. And sometimes a child that qualifies for an IEP becomes eligible for public preschool education, and they will attend a public preschool, and the preschool team will work on their IEP goals and skill development. And that is a really, really great way to set your child up for good kindergarten readiness. So I encourage this program when you have a child that might be experiencing some developmental needs. All right, then we move on to school-based supports. And give me 1 minute while I take a drink. So once your kiddo's in school, as I just mentioned, when they turn 3, they can be evaluated for an IEP. Once they're in school, there are different types of interventions available to them. So the first, and these are, in a way, these are tiered. So you can, the first one is response to intervention, and we'll talk about that. The next is Section 504 plans and individualized education programs. As I said, in a way, these are tiered because as you move from a response to intervention to a 504 plan to an IEP, each level is a little more intense in its supports and more personalized to that student. So here's just another slide, tiered interventions. So tiered interventions are something that can occur without the need for a 504 or IEP. So this happens when a student is having difficulty with academic subject matter. Oftentimes we see this with reading, and they need some additional support, maybe a small pullout group of students that are all sort of in the same achievement level in that subject matter. And they need that additional support to catch up. So the idea of a early intervention, of a RTI response to intervention, my apologies, is that it's meant to be temporary. This is really about catching a student up. So it's meant to be temporary. It's targeted instruction at a specific skill or academic need. And so reading's a good example of that because many schools will, or many, let me start again. When students are struggling, schools will implement something called a reading intervention, a reading improvement plan, or a RIMP. And that RIMP will allow them to pull the student out into a smaller group where they can target some of the reading skills they need to develop. And sometimes what happens with reading is the students falling behind the rest of their peers, and the classroom is continuing on through skills, but they're still trying to master skills that have already been covered. So a RIMP allows the school to pull them into a smaller group and reinforce those skills that have already been covered in the classroom and hopefully catch them up to their peers. So that's the intent of response to interventions. I think an important thing to note here is it can be a little bit murky when you need to progress from response to interventions to evaluating for an IEP. So I encourage families to seek advice when they're unsure, because I think that can be a complicated conversation with the school team. And the school team knows the response to intervention and IEP relationship very well, and this is often uncharted territory for parents. Many school districts have an ECAG parent mentor. So that's an exceptional children's advocacy group parent mentor. That can sometimes be a good resource to sort of suss out whether or not your child just needs RTI or if they need something more. I think some good indicators of whether your child needs to progress from RTI to an IEP evaluation is if they've been in that response to intervention for a while and you're not seeing progress. Um, and an important distinction here is I think it needs to be meaningful progress. So if they're progressing, but the gap between like their skill level and their peer skill level is not decreasing, I think that is a good time to talk about whether or not that student needs to be evaluated. So say, for example, you have a first grader on a RIMP at the beginning of their first grade year. The school district uses something called a cadence to test them for reading, and that a cadence score comes back in the beginning and it's not great. And so they put the student on a RIMP, um, and they track that student's progress while they're on the RIMP and receiving reading intervention. Mid-year, their scores do not improve, and you see the gap between them and their peers widening. And then towards the end of the year, you continue to not see meaningful progress. I think that's an appropriate time to say, we've tried these interventions. I'm concerned the student needs more. The other important thing to know about interventions is that the school district cannot delay IEP evaluations for RTI. So if you're hearing like, oh, well, let's do RTI first and then look at whether we should evaluate, that is not, they can't delay. They can say that they don't suspect a disability and they'd like to implement response to intervention and see how it goes, but they can't delay the conversation of whether they suspect a disability for RTIs. All right, so moving on, we'll talk about Section 504 and IDEA. So students can receive a 504 plan or an IEP, depending on whether they qualify. And these two different educational supports are actually born out of two different laws. We won't get into the nitty-gritty of the law today, but I think it's just helpful background knowledge to know that these actually come from different laws because they are administered differently. In some ways, 504s and IEPs are very similar, but there are important distinctions, and those distinctions typically stem from the law. So 504 plans come out of the Rehabilitation Act. The Rehabilitation Act applies whether you're in school, whether you're a K-12 student, or whether you are in college or an adult. So that is helpful to know because when your students transition from high school to college, IEPs are only for students in the K and up through 12th grade, or the age 22, which we'll talk about. But once they have graduated from high school, they're no longer covered by IDEA. So if they have needs for supports in the college setting, you would fall back on Section 504. The purpose of Section 504 is to create equality, and that's what this fun graphic is meant to show. Is to create equity. So it's essentially like leveling the playing field, right? So this is giving the students some additional supports so that they can access the educational environment despite their disability. So if a student has ADHD, they might be on a 504 to help reduce distractions in the classroom for small group testing and things like that, because it helps them better access the curriculum. IDEA has a more specific eligibility process, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this IEPs are actually designed to meet the unique needs of that child. So these are more personalized, and they're more specific too. 504 plans are typically just accommodations, maybe services, but IEPs actually have like written goals. The goals are supposed to be tracked. You're supposed to show meaningful progress. These are definitely more specific. So this slide, I basically covered everything on this slide. I just like to include it because it will go into our handout. It's a good reference tool if you need to look at the difference between 504s and IEPs. I'll point you to the eligibility. I mentioned that getting qualified for an IEP is a more intense process. So you'll see here there's 3 criteria points, whereas for Section 504, it's a little more relaxed, and we'll talk about that now. All right, so to qualify for a 504 plan, the student must have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So this can be a variety of things. I know I use ADHD as an example a lot, but it's a good example because some ADHD students need a 504 and some need an IEP, and it really just depends on how their ADHD manifests. Um, so it's not uncommon to find that a student with ADHD needs a 504. This is typically because while the disability is impacting them, they're maybe not experiencing very poor grades or significant behavior issues, but it is impacting their ability to be in the school setting and access the learning to some extent. So an IEP eligibility has some different requirements. So first, to be found eligible for an IEP, the school team needs to determine that the student fits into one of 13 disability categories. So those are the categories that are listed at the bottom of the slide. For students aged 2 to 10, they can be eligible under the developmental delay category. So when I was talking about the transition from early intervention services to turning 3 and being evaluated for an IEP, students are often identified under developmental delay because they're showing some developmental delays, but they're still too young for a formal diagnosis. So you might have a kid that has like very strong sensory needs, and is very active, but that child's still too young for something like an ADHD diagnosis. So that's why the developmental delay category exists. This category used to only be for ages 2 to 6, and just in April, it has changed from ages 2 to 10. So that's a really great thing for families because before, when you were transitioning to kindergarten, you would need to be found eligible under one of these other categories. But again, your student may still be too young for a formal diagnosis. It may be a little unclear whether they fit into one of these other categories. So they can continue with their developmental delay category. Some other common categories we work in: specific learning disability, other health impairments, so things like ADHD and anxiety often fall under here, autism, and emotional disturbance, not as frequently as the others, but those are ones that we see often. When we're making this eligibility determination, you'll see at the top, this is actually from an IEP eligibility worksheet. It can be a little confusing, so we always go over this with clients before the meeting. But the three factors are the three questions are: is the determining factor for the child's poor performance is not due to a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math, or in child's limited English proficiency? So this is just making sure that they are receiving the instruction. The child meets the state criteria for having a disability based on the data provided in this document. So that is one of these 13 disability categories. And the child demonstrates an educational need that requires specifically designed instruction. So this third bullet point is where you get the distinction between 504s and IEPs. And a 504, like we said, is a disability that impacts them in any major life activity. So that is more broad than the 13 disability categories. The second point is that for a 504, it just needs to impact them in the school setting in some way, but for an IEP, it has to impact them in a way that requires specifically designed instruction. So for example, if you have a student that is having a really hard time reading, like maybe they have dyslexia, right? And they need to be taught to read a different way than the rest of the population. That is specially designed instruction related to reading. And they might be categorized under specific learning disability for reading. We find that student qualifies for an IEP because they need that specially designed instruction. The other thing that I think is really important here is that the need for specially designed instruction is not limited to academics. So academics is certainly a metric, but the law is very clear that the decision for eligibility should not solely be based on academics. So a student may be performing very well, but have strong social emotional needs. And those social emotional needs are definitely relevant in this discussion. I think sometimes they get glossed over. They're a little um, it's a little bit easier to articulate academic needs because there's so much scoring and testing and grades that you can rely on for that conversation. But social emotional needs are just as important. So if you ever have a school team that's like, no, they're really thriving academically, so they don't qualify, that is not a full analysis of IEP eligibility. So it is important to think about the social emotional impacts. A great example is anxiety, because when a student is anxious, their brain is not fully accessible for learning. So if a student is having anxious thoughts at school, they're not actually fully attuned to the classroom and successfully learning in that environment. Um, so really, it's that need for specially designed instruction that creates the distinction between the 504 and the need for an IEP. All right, so the nitty-gritty of the IEP evaluation process. The 504 process is less structured, and typically involves you going to the school, asking for 504 supports. The school will have a meeting to discuss that student's disability, and then determine whether or not they qualify for a 504 and create a draft 504. The IEP process it has a few more steps, and those steps are more regulated by the law. So one thing that I want to point out before we dive into this is an important thing to know about the 504 and the IEP process is that when your student has a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis, that diagnosis does not necessarily mean that they would qualify for a 504 or an IEP. So when you begin the education process, it's important to keep in mind that the education team is looking at that student's disability in terms of how it manifests at school. So some students really can manage their disability at school and it doesn't manifest and present itself at school. So that can be a really frustrating moment for parents because you know your kid has anxiety, you know your kid has ADHD, you know your kid is, struggling with some other condition. But it's not really presenting at school. And so the school team will say, there's not much we can do with this because it's not presenting at school. So we don't have any way to support it because it's not presenting at school. So that's just important to keep in the back of your mind. It can be a difficult and tough conversation. There are certainly times when the school team feels like the condition isn't presenting at school, but the parents are actually seeing something different. I think this can be difficult for students that internalize. So some students, when they're having difficulty with a disability, are really external with their symptoms. You'll see them visibly upset. They'll have outbursts. Other students internalize. These are our people pleasers that don't want to let people down. And those internalizers, they look like they're not presenting at school, but truly in their brain, they are struggling deeply. So just keep that in mind. It is the combination of the diagnosis, or even if your kid isn't diagnosed, but they're having trouble at school, and how it's impacting them at school. So the evaluation process starts on day 0 when the parent requests a school evaluation. And the best way to do this is in writing. So I encourage families to send an email to their teacher, copy the principal, and if there's if you know who the school psychologist is or the school counselor, and you can say, I am concerned that my child has a disability that's impacting them at school. Here is the reason for my concern. It doesn't need to be long, one or a couple of sentences. I'd like to meet as soon as possible to talk about evaluating my student for an IEP. Within 30 days of that request, the district must meet to discuss your request. So this is why it's important to put your request in writing so that it's easy to track that you made the request. And when you've reached the 30-day mark, also make sure that written request says, I am asking for an IEP evaluation, so that there's no misunderstanding. Sometimes clients come to me and they were like, I told the school he was struggling with anxiety. And the school will say, oh, but we didn't know you were asking for an evaluation. So it's always important to say, I'm asking for an IEP evaluation. So within 30 days, the district must meet and either agree or refuse to evaluate. So they will have a meeting with you where they discuss whether or not the school team suspects a disability. And this is where you begin to hear that conversation of whether or not they see that student's disability in the school setting. Um, After this meeting, you will receive what's called a PRO1. It's called a prior written notice, which sounds a little counterintuitive because you get it after the meeting, but the prior written notice will document what the request was and what the district's decision was. So the request being to evaluate for an IEP, and it will document whether or not they agreed or decided not to evaluate. That's an important piece of paper to keep, particularly if they deny the evaluation and then you come back to them later. You want to be able to say, hey, like we've come to you with this issue before. So PRO1s are always really important to keep. Then 60 days from if they choose to evaluate, you will have what's called a planning meeting. In that planning meeting, the team will decide which of those 13 categories they're going to look at. So are they going to look at autism, specific learning disability, other health impairment? I encourage families to include as many as you think are likely. And it's probably, something like OHI and specific learning disability or because when you go through this process, they will do the evaluations. And at the end, they will only look at those categories that you identified at the beginning. So that can be a little tricky because you can have a student that you really think has a specific learning disability. And then after the evaluation, it'll be clear to you that they better fit under OHI. So you just want to make sure you have all of the potential categories on the table. So the planning meeting will do two things. It will identify the categories they're going to look at and then how they're going to assess it, which assessments are going to complete and how they're going to do it. So some assessments are like formal assessments where they observe the student, they meet with the student, they do rating scales. In other areas, they may do like a records review, but as much as possible, you want them doing like formal assessments with observations. And I would typically say like 2 observations or more, depending on the student's needs. So we have day 0, you requested. Within 30 days, they said yes or no about evaluating. 60 days from that decision about evaluating, which is 90 days in, the team will have something called an evaluation team report. And that will be the compilation of all of the assessments they've done. And that report is what we use to determine whether they're eligible for an IEP. So you will have the ETR report, and then you will have a meeting with the school team to review the report and decide whether or not that student qualifies for an IEP based on the evaluation team report. If the student qualifies, they must have a draft IEP within 30 days. Or I'm sorry, the IEP must be in place within 30 days. So they will be working on the IEP and scheduling a meeting, hopefully 2 weeks, 3 weeks out. And you will come back and have another meeting to review the IEP. And then a full year after the IEP has been implemented, you will have an annual review. So there is a review every year. And then every 3 years, you can come up for reevaluation. The important thing to know about once an IEP is in place is you can always ask for an IEP meeting. You do not have to wait for this annual meeting. So if something changes with your child or you have some concerns, you're concerned about their progress on their goals, you are always allowed to ask for an IEP meeting. It's not something you need to be shy about. So that's an important thing for parents to know. All right. Okay, so just a quick review of IEP structure. And I'm actually going to pause here for a minute to see if anyone has questions before we dive in. I feel like I've covered a lot. So I'm going to take a quick minute to pause. If you have questions, you can feel free to unmute. Yes, the slides will be available after the presentation. So after the presentation, we will distribute the slides and I believe a recording as well. Any other questions? All right. I am going to get back to the presentation then. All right, so here I'm just going to touch on the structure of an IEP. This is a pretty bulky document sometimes, typically at least like 25 pages, and understanding the different sections of the IEP can be very helpful. Again, this is often a very foreign landscape for parents. So the first section is the profile. This is going to give a general overview of your student. It's going to talk about their strengths, their weaknesses, if they have any diagnoses. The second is going to be the annual goals. And so here you will have a set of goals based on the student's needs. The amount of goals varies depending on their needs. But for example, if you have a student with academic needs, they might have a reading goal, they might have a math goal. If you have a student with social emotional needs, they might have a goal related to like social skills or self-regulation or calming strategies. They might have a goal related to behavior. So all of that will be in the goals section. And within each goal, there's a present level of performance. So this is really important. I think it's important to make sure that the present levels of performance are a true depiction of where your student is at that moment in time, because, you know, at the next annual review, they're going to do a new present level of performance. And you want to be able to look at each year's present level of performance and really understand where that student was at that moment in time. The thing about an IEP is we always call this a living, breathing document. So it changes as the student changes. So you want that present level of performance to be accurate. You always want to be thinking about in the back of your head, what will be helpful to me in 5 years, right? If in 5 years we're still struggling with some behavior need, what information will be helpful to me to identify sort of the progress or lack of progress of that skill? And the present level of performance can be a really helpful tool. In the present level of performance, I think it's helpful to identify what age appropriate or grade level peers are doing. So if they're describing some behavioral, social needs, academic needs, if they're citing to academic data, sometimes you will have the scores, but you won't have that benchmark back to what their same age peers or grade level peers are doing. So if it's not in there, ask. The goal needs to be measurable. So it needs, meaning that there needs to be a way to track the goal. that so that is the method for measuring progress. And then measurable objectives. So oftentimes goals will have subparts that are called objectives. And those subparts sort of break down the goal. So the goal will have sort of a larger concepts and then it'll be broken down. The other thing about goals is they need to be attainable in a year. It's a little bit of a tricky calculation, but you shouldn't have a goal that the kid can master in 3 months. You shouldn't have a goal that's really focused on something they should be able to do in 3 years. So it just needs to be well calibrated. The third section will identify specially designed instruction. So this is the special instruction they're going to provide, the need for the IEP, right? So this will identify if there's a special reading instruction, if there's some sort of special social emotional instruction the student's going to receive, special math instruction. Some of our students that are have cognitive delays have a different set of curriculum that will be identified. Related services, accommodations. So these do kind of go in tandem, but related services is if that student needs to meet with someone to work on those skills. So are they going to be meeting with a speech therapist? Are they going to be meeting with an occupational therapist? That would be identified in related services, and they will identify a certain set of minutes that that student will spend with that person. Um, Related services can be one-on-one. They can also be what we call push-in services, in that the therapist will come into the classroom setting and support the student there. They can also be consultative services. And so that is when the therapist provides advice to the classroom teacher on how to meet your student's needs based on their condition. So like kiddos with sensory needs. So occupational therapy helps in a few ways. It can help with like motor skills, but it can also help with sensory needs. So an OT might consult with the teacher about different things they can do in the classroom to help with that student's sensory needs. The OT may also need to meet with them one-on-one. So it can be a combination of both. Um, Accommodations are all these little things that we can do in the school environment to help that student with their disability. Um, and then, so those are things such as like preferential seating. If a student needs to be closer to the teacher in the classroom because they're, often distracted by things. Small group testing, um, extended time on tests. Those are accommodations. Number 7 is placement. So this is where your student is going to receive their education. Oftentimes this is in the general ed setting. And then number 8 is extended school year. And that's typically something you talk to your IEP teams about in like April or May. So this is a good slide. I'm not going to go through it all. You guys can have it for reference, but some common accommodations, related services, modifications. I touched on this a minute ago, but again, the accommodations are a really important part of the IEP. These are also things you can see in a 504 as well. So if your student doesn't qualify for an IEP, they may have these same accommodations in a 504. So shortened assignments, if a student shows mastery but has a lot of anxiety around assignments, you might ask for shortened assignments. If a student's struggling with composition or writing, but you're working on a academic task that isn't about composition or writing, you can ask for oral responses, extended time, small group testing, preferential seating, breaks and movement breaks. I think this is really important because often the kids we work with need breaks. Breaks are really important for their success in school. Breaks can happen a few different ways. There can be timed breaks. So this is when you actually have a break schedule. That's really helpful for your younger kiddos where they're relying on an adult to signal that they need a break. So those scheduled breaks can be very helpful. Other times breaks are at the student's choice, or when a teacher can recognize that they need a break. And then the different types of breaks. Some kiddos do really well with, like, I just need to go somewhere and be calm for a moment. Some of our kiddos are full of energy and could run all day, and they don't need a calm sitting break. They need a movement break. So sort of understanding what that break looks like is important as well. Chunking assignments is something we do for students with like executive functioning or ADHD. This is when a teacher gives like a very, they give an assignment that may take a long time or has many steps, and they just present it to the classroom. And part of what the students need to do is manage the steps of that assignment. Well, we can ask them to chunk those assignments. So instead they're giving that assignment to that student in parts and sort of helping them progress through the parts of that assignment. So least restrictive environment. This is a very important aspect of IEP and IDEA. We don't want students to get on an IEP and end up in this very small environment where they don't get exposure to the rest of the school population. So there's always an emphasis on placing the student in the least restrictive environment that can meet their needs. So it's important that environment meets their needs. We're balancing the environment that meets the student's needs with exposure and opportunity to be with classmates. Um, so the least restrictive environment is the general education environment. And so that can be this is what we also call the most inclusive environment. So this is you can have the student in the general education environment supported by the accommodations they're receiving and or services. Um, the next step up is in-class support. So that was what I talked about with like push-in. If someone's coming in to support them in the classroom at times. Then there's a resource center. So this is a place where they can go to work on their schoolwork in a smaller setting with the support of an intervention specialist. And then self-contained, this is when you start getting to they're spending their school day or parts of their school day in a smaller, self-contained environment with other students that have needs. Um, and then public special education. And then as you advance through the continuum, you could end up at private special education. And that occurs when we have a student where the school district just doesn't have the tools and the staffing to meet that student's needs. Their needs are significant enough or specialized enough that the public school district cannot meet their needs. And so we place them in a private setting. Okay, so I think it's helpful to go through an exercise. So I wanted to provide a couple of scenarios for you guys. The first is a scenario involving a student with ADHD and sensory needs. So if you're unfamiliar with sensory needs, some kids have poor sensory integration, and that means that they can be overly sensitive to their environment or undersensitive. So kiddos that are overly sensitive, like loud noises and bright lights might they're sensitive to them, and that might be difficult for them in the school setting. Kids that are undersensitive, they tend to not feel things as strongly as we do, and so they do what we call sensory seeking. So they're constantly seeking sensory input. This could be a kid that's like crashing and jumping a lot. They're getting that they're seeking that pressure, that sensory pressure. So you have sensory avoiders, you have sensory seekers, and then you can have combos. So let's say you have a kiddo with ADHD. He's a sensory seeker for the most part. And what are some things that might help that kiddo in the school setting? I list them here. So the first is sensory breaks. This is a little bit like the movement breaks I talked about, but a little more purposeful about the type of movement. So like pushing heavy objects can be like a sensory break, right? It could also be a movement break. So sensory breaks, movement breaks, sometimes they're used interchangeably. Heavy work, that's like that pushing the large object. Preferential seating. So the way I wrote this out, the first three, like those would address the sensory needs, right? Sensory break, movement break, heavy work, the need for fidgets, that could also help. The next column, this would address the more ADHD-like needs, preferential seating, chunking, which we talked about already, prompts and redirection. So these students often need to be prompted to do their schoolwork, and redirection when they get off task. So this looks like the teacher walking around the classroom, and she knows that she has to stop at Johnny's desk more often to prompt him to move on to the next step or to redirect him if he gets distracted. Another thing that can be very helpful for kiddos with executive functioning or ADHD needs, visual organizers and visual schedules. So it can be very helpful for them to see in a graph or some visual type of way what their schedule is going to be for the day. And that will help them sort of be prepared for what's coming and move through each part of the day. Same thing with organizers. Some kiddos with ADHD actually need like purposeful help with a planner. Like not just that you gave them a planner, but you taught them how to use it. And those planners should be very visual because getting lost in like the clutter of a document can be difficult. So the other scenario would be a student with anxiety and some behavior concerns and also sensory. So let's say for this purpose, the sensory needs are a little more avoidance and less seeking. Some things you might get for this child and related to behavior manifests in a bunch of ways. So, this could be a student that has for tantrums that aren't typical for their age. This could be a student that withdraws often for various reasons. So behaviors come in a variety of forms. But for this student, we might offer calming breaks and choices. Choices can be really helpful with a student that is sort of strong-willed and will have some behavioral reactions. So offering choices are always a great tool. We empower our children in a healthy way when we do that. Identifying a trusted adult. So a student with anxiety, um, it can be helpful for them to know, like, this is the trusted adult I can go to when I'm having a difficult moment. And then sometimes, depending on the school, they might need like a special pass that you can identify in the IEP that allows them to seek out that trusted adult when they need them. Extended test time, frequent reinforcements for desired behavior. Again, we're trying to target the behavior needs here, and we're trying to use positive reinforcement. So this is a nice thing to put in the IEP. So we're really calling out the need to provide more positive reinforcement to the student. Extra time and warning before transitions. So some students struggle with transitions. Anxiety can be part of that. So letting that student know in advance, we've got 5 more minutes and then we're transitioning to lunch. We've got 5 more minutes and then you're transitioning to math. Prompt before calling on students. So students with anxiety and in other scenarios, the anticipation of being called on can be really anxiety inducing. So for some students, we ask that there's no cold calling and that they're prompted before they call on the student. So this would look like a teacher that's going through instruction and says, okay, Rachel, I'm going to call on you for number 4, right? Or Rachel, can you think about how you would handle that scenario? And I'm going to get back to you. So that gives them time to think. They know they're not like just put on the spot. And again, we talked about the positive reinforcement. This student might need OT as a related service. So they might need OT to meet with them to work on those sensory needs and different calming strategies for the anxiety. They might also benefit from counseling as a service to help them work on, again, like what to do with their anxiety, calming strategies, if they're, what the behavior concerns are, and then give us some good replacement strategies for those behaviors. And it may actually be very helpful for that student to have regular time with the counselor to work on those skills in an isolated setting, and then to help that student transfer those skills into the school setting. Right, and then my last slide is the best practices, and then I'll open it up for questions. So here's some best practices. The number one best practice is to be collaborative. You are part of the team. I'm sure many of you know and appreciate that your student is going to be at that school for a while. You may have siblings coming behind that student, and you want to maintain a good, healthy relationship with your school team, even when you're frustrated. So as much as you can, as often as you can, be a collaborative partner with the school team when you're working through an IEP or 504. In the rare instances where I have a case that progresses to the need for due process, which is sort of like a trial related to the student's IEP and whether or not the school like appropriately administered the IEP, one of the first things the school district might say is, this was not a helpful collaborative parent. This parent was almost a roadblock, right? And so we don't really ever want to be in that situation. That's more of like the lawyer perspective of this, but it's always helpful to be collaborative and to maintain a good relationship. Everything in writing. I kind of talked about this when we talked about how to request an IEP. It's just really important to have everything in writing for a variety of reasons, not just in case you end up in a difficult situation with the school team, but also because it's a lot of information. Like, and especially when you're starting the process, there's several steps, and being able to go back to your email or a file you keep. Many families have binders, which are super helpful. That is a very helpful tool to have when you need to remember something that happened like 3 meetings ago, or even something that happened at the last meeting a week ago. Our brains are occupied by our children and, other things that are going on in our lives. So having everything in writing is a really useful tool. I encourage families when you start the process to create a binder. And as soon as you get that evaluation team report, put it in the binder because there are going to be many documents to follow. And having that is going to be super helpful. Have a folder on your computer where you're putting all of the education documents. So everything in writing. Bring a support person. Maybe you don't think you need an education advocate or an attorney, but always having another person there is helpful. It's important to know that it's important to acknowledge that we are parents and we feel emotional about our kids. And there's a lot that happens in these meetings. Even if we took emotion off the table, these meetings, they cover a lot of ground. It's stuff you don't talk about every day. So it's a little bit foreign, the material. Having a second set of ears there can be very, very helpful, especially when you're reflecting on the meeting and you're trying to make decisions about what to do next. Um, Before the meeting, check the invite for attendees. Like the school team brings a lot of people sometimes. So it's just helpful. It's a helpful thing to orient yourself with who's coming. Make sure you bring relevant records. And this is not just school records. This can be assessments that have been done privately. If your student's been diagnosed with a certain condition, you might want to bring the assessment evaluation related to that diagnosis. If your student's been working with a therapist, you might want them to write you a letter that that identifies what that student is struggling with, how they've been working on it in therapy, any strategies that are helpful. As often as you can implement a strategy at home and at school, it reinforces the success of that strategy. So if the private psychologist or therapist is working on a strategy that they find to be helpful, we want to communicate that to the team. Strategies that are not helpful, triggers. So the therapist or psychologist can identify all of those things. What's the condition? How does it manifest? Strategies that work, strategies that don't work, triggers, and then any suggestions they have for the school setting. So organize your records. I already talked about that. Write down your goals and concerns. It's helpful to take a minute to write down what you're hoping to accomplish and then bring it with you because inevitably, as that meeting progresses, you might just start to lose your thoughts. So having that written down is super helpful. Research your child's condition, and you can also research it in terms of IEP and 504. So like you can Google something like common ADHD accommodations in an IEP and you'll get stuff back. So you can spend a little time if you feel like you need better oriented with that and the options. It really is the school's job to bring resources to the table and to help educate you on ways that they can help support their disability. But it's always best if you come empowered with information and ideas. Um, be prepared for emotional advocacy. So, what I mean by this is, again, these are our children and we have feelings about them as we should. It's very personal for us. So, just know that you are probably going to feel emotional, and just knowing that um, and acknowledging that can help you when it begins to happen in the moment. You're not wrong to be emotional. Sometimes my clients cry, sometimes they get visibly frustrated. And I always tell them, it's okay to be emotional about your children. In fact, I'd be surprised if you weren't. And you are your child's best advocate because I will never be able to advocate with the level of emotion that you have because it's not my child. So it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to cry. I think as long as you come back to that collaborative tone at the end and come back to, we appreciate you being here. We appreciate what you're doing for our student. Um, unless unless for some reason things are really bad and you don't want to say that. But I do think like it's okay to be emotional and just do your best to end the meeting on a good note. The other thing is when you're working with an advocate or an attorney like me, you have the room to be emotional because I'm going to be there and I am going to be more focused on the steps and the procedures and making sure I capture all the right information. And that gives you a little freedom to absorb the information with less pressure to absorb the information in real time, effectively in real time, and then also respond to it appropriately. So having someone like an advocate or an attorney there can really take the pressure off so that you can advocate for your kid and what you know about your kid. Extracurriculars, keep in mind, like, when you can get your student involved in extracurriculars, this can be a super great support for developing social skills. Um, when kids feel included in their school environment, they often thrive more. So extracurriculars are important to cover and often get overlooked because there's so many other things you're trying to cover. The school to home connection, I talked about this a little bit with the therapist. If there's things you're doing at home that are working, tell the school about it. If the school is using certain strategies, ask them to share them with you so you can mimic those strategies at home. And then I touched on this earlier, but social emotional matters. If your kid is having social emotional struggles at school, it matters. If you're concerned about how they're handling social scenarios, if you're concerned about their emotional regulation, of how anxiety might be impacting them, this matters just as much as academics. And so don't feel shy about asking about their social emotional needs. All right. So that concludes my presentation. Again, I'm going to open it up for any questions that you all might have. So, and it's okay if you guys don't have questions. We just covered a lot of ground, and that is understandably a lot of information for a Saturday morning. Um, I will give you guys one more minute in case someone was unsure or trying to unmute. Okay, well, as I said, we will provide the slides and the recording of this presentation via email. I appreciate you guys being here. If you think of questions later, please feel free to reach out. I know we covered a lot of ground, so I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys think of them in the future. And with that said, you guys can go have a great Saturday. The weather is beautiful, so enjoy it.